everyone, welcome back to Alice and the Giant Bookshelf. Today's video is a reader's guide to none other than Hercule Poirot. Hi everyone, or should I say bonjour mes amis. Welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you are new. If you're new, I don't always look like this. This video is part of my Reader's Guide series, and in the Reader's Guide 2 series, this is the third one. My first one was about Jack Reacher, and my second one was about Sherlock Holmes, and this is a series all about my favourite characters in fiction. Yeah, today's episode is all about the famous Belgian detective, Monsieur Hercule Poirot. So I have come dressed as the famous Belgian detective, and I think I'm going to have to take off the moustache in a minute, but I thought I would say hello, looking like Poirot himself. Okay, so today we're going to be talking all about Agatha Christie's famous creation, Hercule Poirot. And we're going to be covering the following areas. Number one, who is Hercule Poirot? Who else is important in this series? We're going to look at a bit of a timeline of the books and stories. I'm going to give you a brief summary of the books in their publication order. We're going to have a little bit of a chat about adaptations. And finally, we will talk about where is it best to start with Hercule Poirot. I thought we would talk about Hercule Poirot this week because he has an upcoming adaptation. Death on the Nile is due out this week. I thought in honour of that, which we'll talk about a little bit about later, I would give you my guide to one of my favourite detectives, Hercule Poirot. Firstly, who is Hercule Poirot? Hercule Poirot is the famous Belgian detective who was created by Agatha Christie and introduced in her very first book in 1920, The Mysterious Affair at Styles. He's one of Agatha Christie's most famous characters, and he's also the one that she wrote about the most. He appears in 33 novels by Agatha Christie, a play, and more than 50 short stories. And there is a second play, but it wasn't adapted by Agatha herself. Hercule Poirot was well loved by the public, but not so much by his creator, who did tire of him and his egotistical ways after quite a short time. Poirot is described by his companion and sometime narrator, Captain Hastings, in the very first book as Poirot was an extraordinary looking little man. He was hardly more than 5 feet 4 inches, but carried himself with great dignity. His head was exactly the shape of an egg, and he always perched a little on one side. His moustache was very stiff and military. The neatness of his attire was almost incredible. I believe a speck of dust would have caused him more pain than a bullet wound. Yet this quaint, dandified little man had been in his time one of the most celebrated members of the Belgian police. Poirot is frequently described throughout the series as having very fine moustaches, in which he takes huge pride and care. It is always described as having 2 upward curling points. As Hastings said in that passage, he is extremely neat. As Hastings also mentioned, he was a celebrated member of the Belgian police, but he is retired by the time of the first book, and he's a post-World War I refugee in England. He goes on to solve numerous crimes throughout the Agatha Christie books, using his little grey cells, and in The Mystery of the Blue Train, he's very proud to declare himself probably the greatest detective in the world. Poirot has green eyes, which are often mentioned as shining when he has a clever idea, and he has dark hair. Let's move on to some of the other characters of importance. Captain Arthur Hastings is Poirot's faithful Dr. Watson type character. However, unlike Watson, Hastings actually only appears in 8 of the Poirot novels. He does narrate those that he appears in, and all 8 of those were written before 1940, apart from Curtin, Poirot's last case. This story reunited the old friends at the scene of their first case together, Styles. Hastings meets a music hall actress, Dulce Duveen, in Murder on the Links, and they marry and go to live on a ranch in Argentina. So from then on, Hastings' appearances are limited to when he visits Poirot. The books Hastings features in are Mysterious Affair at Styles, Murder on the Links, The Big Four, Peril at End House, The ABC Murders, Lord Edgware Dies, Dumb Witness and Curtain. And Hastings also features in and narrates most of the Poirot short stories. Miss Lemon is another side character. She is Poirot's secretary and she features in 4 of the later Poirot books. She's described by Poirot as incredibly efficient, but also as very unkindly, as unbelievably ugly. Next up we have Ariadne Oliver. Ariadne Oliver is one of my favourite characters in Christie, and she is a mystery novelist who pops up in several Poirot cases, particularly his later ones, and she's a bit of a Christie substitute. She has many of Agatha Christie's own personality traits and likes, for example her love of apples, her frustration at her leading detective character, and some of Agatha Christie's own physical traits. Christie also used Ariadne as a way of discussing some of her own mistakes in her work. She appears in Cards on the Table, Mrs McGinty's Dead, Dead Man's Folly, Third Girl, Halloween Party and Elephants Can Remember. She also featured in The Pale Horse without Poirot. The Ariadne Oliver books are best read in order because Ariadne herself often refers back to previous cases with Poirot, and there are even some spoilers for Mrs McGinty's Dead in Halloween Party. So definitely read Mrs McGinty's Dead before Halloween Party. Detective Chief Inspector Japp appears in several of the short stories and he's also mentioned in others. He has a minor role in The Big Four and Peril at End House before becoming a main character in Lord Edgware Dies. He also acts as a partner to Poirot in Death in the Clouds and 1-2 Buckle My Shoe, and he's also involved in the ABC murders. He is a competent detective, but he cannot keep up with the might of Hercule Poirot's Little Grey Cells. Colonel Race is another character featuring in more than one Poirot book, and he is a very rich ex-army colonel, and he features as a side detective in 4 Christie books, although only 2 of them are with Poirot, Cards on the Table and Death on the Nile. He's quick to detect facts. Final character I thought I would mention is George. He is Poirot's valet. He is described as tall, cadaverous and unemotional in the short story The Underdog, and he appears in 6 of the novels and several short stories. For ease of talking about the many novels, I've only included the short stories as collections. Some short story collections by Christie will only feature 1 or 2 Poirot stories, so I'm not really going to talk about those ones here. Short story collection Poirot's Early Cases is clearly chronologically set earlier than some of the other books, but it was published later. The short story collections I've referred to here are the UK editions, and they do differ from the US editions, which in some places collect different stories under different titles. I'm going to show you here first the publication order of the books. This is largely also the chronological order of the books. The books started in 1920 with The Mysterious Affair at Styles. You can see here some of the most famous Agatha Christie Poirot books were published in the 1930s. She wrote very prolifically about Poirot in the 30s and into the 40s, 50s. She was still writing about him in the 60s and 70s, Poirot's last case coming out in 1975. There are 2 short story collections which feature Poirot stories, although they also feature stories with other detectives, Problem at Pollensa Bay and While the Light Lasts. Hercule Poirot and the Greenshaw Folly came out in 2014. This is a novella which was actually turned into the novel Dead Man's Folly. It didn't actually get published in this novella format until 2014. There is a very helpful chronological list of books on the official Agatha Christie website. The basic difference is just where you read some of the short story collections. So here is a suggestion of the chronological order. Let me give you a very brief rundown, without any spoilers of course, of all of the books. The Mysterious Affair at Styles. Poirot meets Captain Hastings at the home of Emily Inglethorpe, the eponymous Styles. His detective skills are put to the test when Emily is killed. This is Agatha Christie's very first book, and it's full of her ingenious plotting. In The Murder on the Links, Poirot is called to France but arrives too late to save his client, who is found dead on the golf course. Poirot Investigates collects 11 of the earlier Poirot short stories. The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, one of Christie's most famous plots, a variation on the locked room mystery involving suicide and murder. The Big Four started life as 12 short stories which were reworked into a novel. This one involves 4 master criminals who pit themselves against Poirot. The Mystery of the Blue Train. Poirot's first train outing is less well thought of than the later, more famous one. Here he investigates the theft of a famous jewel and the murder of its owner. Black Coffee is a play featuring Poirot, written by Christie, which was later novelised by Charles Osborne. Poirot and Hastings investigate the poisoning of a famous physicist. Peril at End House features Poirot and Hastings trying to protect the owner of End House, Nick Buckley, from repeated attempts on her life. Lord Edgware Dies has also been published as 13 at Dinner. During a supper party, Lady Edgware expresses a desire to get rid of her husband. Within 24 hours, he is dead. Can Poirot solve the case? Murder on the Orient Express, one of Poirot's most famous cases. During an unexpected snowdrift, the body of one of the passengers on the Orient Express is found stabbed. In a closed circle mystery like no other, Poirot must find out which of his fellow travellers is the guilty party. In 3-act tragedy, 13 guests arrive for dinner at an actor's house, and the Reverend Stephen Babington chokes on his cocktail and dies. Poirot is troubled by a case where not only is there no trace of poison found, but there's no motive found either. Another excellent closed room mystery is Death in the Clouds. When Poirot's flight lands, one of the passengers is found murdered. It's up to Poirot to find out who done it. The ABC Murders is the mysterious dark tale of a serial killer who seems to be working his way through an alphabet of victims using an ABC railway guide. Alice Asher in Andover, Betty Barnard in Bexhill, and so on. Can Poirot and Hastings stop the murders? Murder in Mesopotamia. An archaeological expedition is halted by a murder. The archaeologist's wife had complained of death threats before her untimely death. Poirot, travelling in Iraq, is called in to unravel the mystery. Cards on the Table is one of the best closed circle mysteries. Poirot and a group of detectives are all present in the room, along with 4 suspects, when Mr. Shaitana is murdered. Dumb Witness. Miss Emily Arundel wrote to Poirot before her death, suspicious of her family. Poirot goes to investigate, and he's helped along the way by the only witness, Bob the dog. Death on the Nile involves a large cast of characters, many of whom are not as they seem. Beautiful, rich Lynette Doyle is killed on a trip on the Nile, but the immediate suspect is cleared. So who did it? Murder in the Mews is a collection of 4 longer Poirot short stories. In Appointment with Death, Poirot is on another trip when he overhears the words, "You do see, don't you, that she's got to be killed?" This book revolves around the Boynton family and, of course, murder. Hercule Poirot's Christmas is a truly brilliant locked room mystery in which the disliked patriarch of a family is killed at Christmas time and Poirot must solve this seemingly impossible case. Sad Cypress. In this one, Poirot seeks to prove the innocence of Eleanor Carlyle, who is in the dock accused of murder with damning evidence against her. Can Poirot find out the truth? 1-2 Buckle My Shoe sees Poirot investigating the seeming suicide of his dentist. Does a shoe buckle hold the key to this entire mystery? Evil Under the Sun. On yet another of Poirot's holidays, a dead body is found sunbathing on the beach. Was it a crime of passion or a more carefully planned murder? 5 Little Pigs. If you've been watching my channel at all, you'll know that this is one of my favourite Agatha Christie's of all time, probably my favourite. And this one centres around Caroline Crail, who was convicted of her husband's murder and later died in prison. Her daughter asks Poirot to go back and clear her name, so he investigates the 5 suspects who it could have been. The Hollow. Poirot goes to lunch at a country house, only to find a murder has just taken place by the pool. The Labours of Hercules. In this short story collection, the cases are linked by Poirot's desire to do his own version of the Labours of Hercules. The Labours of Hercule. In Taken at the Flood, a bomb blast in the London Blitz kills Gordon Clode and leaves his recent wife a widow with a large fortune. Poirot ends up on the case when the dead man's sister-in-law makes a serious claim against his widow. Mrs. McGinty's dead. James Bentley is found guilty of the murder of elderly charwoman Mrs. McGinty, but despite putting together the evidence that convicted him, Superintendent Spence isn't convinced and Poirot goes to the village to solve the case. After the funeral, at her brother's funeral, Cora lets slip that it was murder, then is found savagely murdered the next day. The family solicitor calls in Poirot. Hickory Dickory Dock sees Poirot going to a student hostel to investigate some strange thefts because his secretary, Miss Lemon, is worried. Can he get to the bottom of matters before they get worse? Dead Man's Folly. Ariadne Oliver has set up a murder hunt for the village fete, which is being held at a Devon house based on Christie's own holiday home, Greenway. And unfortunately, the game becomes all too real, even with Poirot on the scene. This is Hercule Poirot and the Greenshaw Folly. It is the same story as Dead Man's Folly, but this is the novella which didn't get published until 2014 because it was reworked into the longer story Dead Man's Folly. Cat Among the Pigeons. A games mistress at a boarding school is found shot dead. Pupil Julia Upjohn calls Poirot in to stop herself becoming the next victim. The Adventure of the Christmas Pudding. Another short story collection for Poirot. Some of these are festive. The Clocks. A dead body is found in a room full of clocks that didn't belong to the victim. Can Poirot solve this baffling case? Third Girl. A girl living with two others in a London flat comes to Poirot to tell him she's a murderer. And then she disappears. Poirot investigates Halloween party. A 13-year-old called Joyce announces before a Halloween party that she saw a murder once. Then she's found dead in the apple bobbing tub after the party. Poirot comes to the aid of his friend Ariadne Oliver, who was at the party. Elephants Can Remember. Poirot revisits a crime committed 15 years earlier with the aid of Ariadne Oliver. Poirot's Early Cases is a short story collection of some of Poirot's earlier cases. And finally, we have Curtain, Poirot's last case. A return to styles for an elderly Poirot and Hastings in one last case together. So that brings us to the end of the Poirot books. Hopefully I've mentioned them all. As I say, there are some short story collections that I haven't mentioned because they have maybe one or two Poirot short stories in them, and there is a complete short stories book available. So let's move on to adaptations. Firstly, a quick word on plays. Alibi was an adapted version of The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, which was written by Michael Morton, and Agatha Christie wrote the other Poirot play, Black Coffee, as an original play featuring Hercule Poirot. When adapting Poirot books for the stage, Agatha Christie quite often removed him. So, there have been a few film adaptations of Poirot. Getting on to more famous adaptations, in 1974 there was an adaptation directed by Sidney Lumet of Murder on the Orient Express. Albert Finney played Poirot, and there was an all-star cast including Lauren Bacall, Ingrid Bergman, Sean Connery and Vanessa Redgrave, to name but a few. This then had a sequel with a different actor playing Poirot, which was the 1978 version of Death on the Nile, featuring Peter Ustinov as Poirot and another all-star cast including Dame Maggie Smith, Angela Lansbury, Mia Farrow and Betty Davis and David Niven, who played Colonel Race. This won an Oscar for Best Costume Design and was followed up in 1982 by Evil Under the Sun, Ustinov's second Poirot film. Unlike the two prior films, this one was not a commercial success, but it was still followed up in 1988 with Appointment with Death, which was Ustinov's final appearance as Poirot. There then haven't been any more big screen adaptations or direct ones until 2017, when a new version of Murder on the Orient Express came out. This one was directed by and starring Kenneth Branagh as Poirot, and again had an all-star cast including Penelope Cruz, Willem Dafoe, Dame Judi Dench, Johnny Depp, Michelle Pfeiffer, Daisy Ridley and Olivia Colman. But I believe this film did well commercially, but was not received particularly well by a lot of fans of Hercule Poirot, because Branagh's Poirot is just not Poirot. In my opinion, obviously some people probably loved it, he took the moustaches too far and made them look really, really silly. The film also feels a bit insulting to fans of the books because it couldn't just be a simple mystery. This is one of the best written mysteries of all time, and Branagh decided to adapt it into an action film. Yeah, it's not my favourite, and it's being followed up this week in fact, with the release of Death on the Nile, which has another all-star cast and more Kenneth Branagh. Although I am not a fan of the Murder on the Orient Express adaptation, I will watch the Death on the Nile adaptation. I'd like to see what happens in it and compare it to the book. But it will be a great shame if the book is again not given a sensible treatment by Branagh. If you're looking for a complete and mostly pretty faithful adaptation of the books, of in fact all of the Poirot canon, the ITV series Agatha Christie's Poirot, which ran from 1989 to 2013, this adapted all of the books and short stories over 13 series and 70 episodes. And this series, of course, stars the great David Suchet as Poirot, and he was very faithful to the character's mannerisms and traits from the books. Hugh Fraser plays Hastings, and Ariadne Oliver was portrayed by Zoe Wanamaker. I do highly recommend checking this series out. All of the major novels translate well onto the screen, some with minor changes, not usually big changes. This was an absolutely great TV series. Suchet will remain for me my perfect vision of Poirot, and he played it so well. There was also an adaptation in 2018 of the ABC Murders starring John Malkovich as Hercule Poirot. On the subject of adaptations, some of the Poirot books have also been adapted as graphic novels, some of which I showed in the book section where I didn't have the book. A few of them have been adapted, and as far as I know these are available in multiple different languages, and they're very good. Do let me know in the comments down below, do you have a favourite Poirot adaptation? If you have seen the David Suchet, do you have a favourite episode? And if you haven't seen the David Suchet, do go and check it out. It's really, really good. We come to the question, where do I start with Hercule Poirot? And the great thing to say about the Poirot books is you really can read them in pretty much any order, and I did. I personally started with Murder on the Orient Express, which isn't necessarily the best place to start, but you can start there. It's a very enjoyable book. I would say though that you won't get to know Poirot hugely in that book in particular. If you like reading the books in order, you can do so. My only major recommendations would be to read Curtain, Poirot's Last Case, last of all. Do not start with this one. Definitely read this last, or if you're only going to read a few Poirot books in your lifetime, then choose the big ones and then read this one last out of the ones that you're reading. It is best, as I've mentioned, to read the Ariadne Oliver books in order, as she often references back to her older cases with Poirot. The main spoiler that she gives is in Halloween Party, and it's for the book Mrs. McGinty's Dead, so it's best to read Mrs. McGinty's Dead before Halloween Party. The plot of Murder on the Orient Express is mentioned in Cards on the Table, so you are better off reading Murder on the Orient Express before Cards on the Table if you don't want any spoilers. There is a really good downloadable guide to reading Poirot on the official Agatha Christie website. I will link this in the description down below because it gives you further tips and it gives you a chronological list for both the US and the UK titles. And as I've said, the differences between the US and the UK books are not that complicated until you get to the short stories, at which point they were collected differently and they have different titles. It's tricky, so do check that out if you're interested in reading the Poirot books, and if you're interested in reading them in order, this is really helpful. A great place to start, of course, is with the first book, The Mysterious Affair at Styles. Or my other recommendation would be to start with a famous one such as Murder on the Orient Express, or potentially Death on the Nile. My issue with telling people to start with Death on the Nile is that it is quite a slow burner to begin with, so if you're starting there, do bear that in mind. It does take a long time to get going and get into the main murder plot, so be cautious of that. I would recommend pretty much any of the early Poirot books to start with. Death on the Clouds is a great one. Lord Edgware Dies is fantastic. Peril at End House, also good. It is good to start with some of the Hastings ones because they came first, and there's quite a different feel in the Ariadne Oliver books that come towards the end of the Poirot sequence. Do check out the Poirot series of books. As you can tell, I have absolutely loved them, and there are weaker ones in the bunch, but the majority are just absolutely brilliant. Do let me know in the comments down below, do you have a favourite Poirot novel? Would you like to see a ranking of my favourite Poirot novels in future? And if you'd like to see a further guide to the short stories, let me know and I will try and get my head around them. There are too many, as I've said, to cover them all here, but what I would recommend for the short stories is getting hold of a copy of the complete short stories. Then you won't miss out on any, whether you're reading the US editions or the UK editions, and whether you're dipping in and out of the other short stories that are not Poirot based. You won't miss any if you get a complete short stories. Do let me know if you would like more advice about these. I think that brings us to the conclusion of my reader's guide to Hercule Poirot. I do hope this has inspired you to pick up Poirot if you haven't already, and do chat to me in the comments about Poirot. I'm happy to answer any questions. I have read all of these books and I am in the process of rereading them again. The only one that I haven't read in its original form at this stage is Black Coffee, which I intend to read as a play, but I have read the novelisation. Thanks for coming by today and watching my reader's guide to Hercule Poirot. I do have 2 other reader's guides if you're interested. I will link the playlist over here for you to go and check out. My guide to Jack Reacher and my guide to Sherlock Holmes if you would like to. If you have enjoyed this video today, please do give it a like. Please do consider subscribing if you haven't already. I hope to make more of these readers' guides about my favourite characters and favourite authors. Poirot is definitely right up there, and it's only taken me this long to make his video because there are so many books to talk about. Thanks for watching today, and I hope you'll all join me again soon for another video all about books here on Alice and the Giant Bookshelf. Bye for now. Au revoir mes amis.